In the past couple of videos, I've been talking about factions in D&D, and I thought it would be fun to see how some real-world factions, specifically the two major political parties in America, might actually teach us an interesting lesson about the most useful ways you can use factions in your own campaign. You might think this is a terrible idea, you might worry that this is a both sides bad video, but I promise, I'm going somewhere with this, and it is related to D&D, I swear. Before we begin, if you're feeling defensive already, or you start to at some point during the video, go ahead and leave a comment. Seriously, you can comment whatever you want to on this video, I really don't mind. And if you choose to engage with others in the comments, be chill down there. You might want to debate some of these topics with each other, and that's okay, but if someone is just making you angry, then step away, cool off, it's not worth it. If you're able to return to it later and respond without becoming upset, then go for it, but remember, nobody in the comments section deserves your time, your response, or your anger. Not because what they're saying isn't wrong, but because your time is precious. Now, before we begin, let's kick things off with some disclaimers, because if I don't, then I'd imagine some commenters are going to take my statements out of context and interpret them in bad faith, and we wouldn't want that. First, I'm going to talk a lot in this video about Democrats and Republicans, but I want to be clear that I'm not talking about voters. That's not because I don't think that we bear any responsibility for who we vote for. We absolutely do. Who you vote for matters. But for the purposes of this video, I don't want to devolve into the typical stereotyping that comes with describing voters. For example, I'm not going to accuse Republican voters of being stupid or ignorant because, yuck, Republicans are all dumb hicks, is a really unhelpful way to talk about these things. Likewise, boiling all Democrat voters down to just smug douchebags isn't really productive either. And if you've ever been on social media, you know there are plenty of dumb and smug people on both sides of every issue in the world, and they're all online all the time. But we probably shouldn't use them as our baseline to judge any political movement as a whole. Likewise, as tempting as it is, I'm not going to spend much of this video using Trump as an example of Republican policies or Biden as the default example of Democrat policies. Both of them did and will run on whatever the platform of their party happens to be, but I'm more interested in examining these parties and their specific policies. This is partially because I don't really think there's anything new to be said about Donald Trump, and partially because I don't know any Democrats who want to be judged based on Joe Biden. I pretty much exclusively vote Democrat, and I do not particularly like or agree with Joe Biden. You vote for him because he's your guy, whether you like him or not, because you think they have the best chance of achieving the policies of the party. That said, Trump and Biden aren't irrelevant to the conversation, so I'm still going to mention them at least a little bit. This is also why I'm not painting voters with a broad brush. Everyone votes for what they perceive will be in their own best interest, and beyond that, people just vote based on their biases and assumptions about the world. Sometimes we might not agree, and sometimes someone is just wrong or misinformed thanks to the echo chamber they get their information from, but we all hold our nose to vote for people we don't like who we hope will still do what we want them to do when they're in power. Anytime I talk about politics, particularly when I take a jab at Republicans, people comment that I'm mocking voters, but that's just not true. So, just so we can be on the same page, in this video, as with most of my videos, when I say Democrats or Republicans, I'm talking about the politicians. When I add voters after the party name, that's when I'm talking about voters. Now, there are definitely plenty of Republican voters I wouldn't like if I got to know them, and it's really not to both sides this, but there are also Democratic voters I wouldn't get along with very well, probably for different reasons. And there are some people, especially online where social media flattens discourse, who really just seem to want the people they disagree with to be miserable or actually wish harm on their political adversaries. In those cases, those people might not actually vote for policies they believe in, but against the people they perceive as their political enemies. But I don't think that's a particularly useful measurement of actual policy. Of course, the fact that we have some actual politicians whose only goal seems to be to advocate for the suffering of others does sort of feel like an indictment of those politicians and their absence of any coherent policy, but we'll get there when we get there. So with all those disclaimers out of the way, let's start the video. First, let's talk about the Democrats. And in order to talk about the lessons we can learn from the Democratic Party, we have to break down their policies, what they stand for, and how they behave. And if we're going to make distinctions between political parties and their voters, then the Democrats kind of struggle here in a pretty profound way. First, let's look at what might be the biggest slam dunk that they absolutely whiffed: abortion. Overwhelmingly, voters of both parties believe abortion should be legal and safe, and the Democrats controlled the White House and both chambers of Congress in 2021. So what did the Democrats do about that? Not much. And once we heard from a leaked report in 2022 that the Supreme Court was going to strike down Roe v. Wade, the Democrats had a chance to codify abortion access into the law, but they didn't do that. Instead, the Supreme Court stripped away a guarantee for reproductive rights, and the Democrats said, I guess you need to vote for us some more. We need to fundraise some more. So that was frustrating. Okay, but what about another big issue, like the border? We know how conservatives feel about the border, and we'll talk about that later, but what do Democrats plan to do about the border? Well, I'm just a goofy YouTube dork, but generally it seems to me that the best solution might be to provide money to support people who cross seeking asylum, to place them in the country so they can live and work and thrive. And since the people coming here are fleeing a humanitarian crisis, say nothing of the humanitarian crisis they're experiencing at the border, and studies show that generally domestic labor is very minimally affected by more immigration, and we could easily compensate for that difference with some additional funds to support everybody. But there don't seem to be that many Democrats standing up and clearly advocating for anything like that. If they are, they're not in the public eye. Instead, the Democratic border policy seems to be ask people not to come here even though they're fleeing climate change and trying to leave the nations whose governments we destabilized. And sometimes their policy is just keep doing Republican immigration policy but be less obvious about it. Just don't tweet about it as much. And I don't know, that doesn't exactly seem like a strong, clear policy, let alone an effective or moral one. Well, how about climate change? Well, there we do have some general progress. Democrats have been pushing for climate change legislation. They are taking it seriously. But I really don't want everything here to have a but the devil's going to be in the details. As just an example, I'm super glad Biden signed the Build Back Better plan, and I'm glad it has so much in it to help combat climate change. But some of these goals could be handled well, or they could be handled poorly. For example, there's a section of the Build Back Better plan that, in theory, could lead to the construction of more mass transit, like trains and subways, which would be good. Making mass transit more common and more reliable and more accessible means fewer people have to drive everywhere, and so that would help cut down on carbon emissions. However, because of the way that it's phrased, it's possible it could instead lead to some cities just building more roads or adding more lanes to existing roads. This would lead to more driving, since there would be more ways for everyone to get where they're going. And that leads to more emissions, more than we have right now. I mean, yeah, it would cut down on traffic, so that's nice, I guess. Traffic sucks, but it kind of seems like there's a better way to do this, and we don't know yet which way this is going to go. What about universal healthcare? That sure would be nice, especially given the fact that tying health insurance to employment was proven to be a bad idea when a disease ripped through the entire world and also caused a bunch of people to lose their jobs. And in fairness, this is an idea that has gotten a lot more popular, and we might actually maybe be making some progress, especially since the Democrats did finally get on board with the concept of taxing the rich, and that would go a long way towards paying for stuff. They say this is what they want to do, and that's a start, at least. Maybe it can even become policy someday. Ooh, think of it. They've also figured out that we need to raise the minimum wage, but the number they're working with hasn't been adjusted for inflation, so it's actually just a half measure, which would still be good, do not get me wrong, but there's room for improvement there, is my point. Additionally, Democrats are taking issues of discrimination seriously, especially when it comes to trans people, but also in terms of protecting BIPOC and LGBTQ people from less obvious forms of discrimination. And while I can guarantee that America is not doing enough to help Native Americans, the Democrats have actually restored land to some tribes and are seeking their help in preserving these lands. It's not nearly enough to make up for the centuries of genocide, but it is a start, and as long as it continues, that would be a good thing. And hey, you know what? Democrats seem to take gun violence seriously, and that's good. Hopefully. We'll see. That being said, there are still plenty of leftist policies that are not popular with Democratic politicians. For example, despite what you may have heard, the movement to defund the police did not really catch on with Democrats. A few mayors cut some police budgets, but on the whole, even that didn't really last very long. Now, I understand the argument that the word defund didn't fully or accurately portray the policy goals, and that made people more defensive than they might normally be, but in truth, I don't totally agree with that argument. We could speculate forever on how the movement might have been received under a different slogan, but you're always going to get pushback no matter what words you use. We can see that in action with the phrase Black Lives Matter, where a bunch of conservatives just reacted to it as if it was implying only Black Lives Matter, which it wasn't. That's not how language works. Or, the complete hijacking and redefining of the word woke or critical race theory, those weren't even calls to action, and they still got bastardized and weaponized. So, I don't think it's the defund the police slogan alone that was the issue. There also just wasn't much follow-through from the Democrats. And that's assuming the Democrats didn't fully try to shut down the movement, which plenty of them did. And this discourse is perfectly summed up by Biden denouncing the idea of defunding the police and then giving his defense of cops.
What I support is the police having the opportunity to deal with the problems they face. And I'm totally opposed to defunding the police officers. As a matter of fact, local police, the only one defunding in his budget calls for a $400 million cut in local law enforcement assistance. They need more assistance. They need, when they show up for a 9/11 call, to have someone with them as a psychologist or psychiatrist to keep them from having to use force and be able to talk people down.
Joe, that was literally the argument behind defund the police. We shouldn't be sending trigger-happy cops to deal with situations that require mental health professionals. Literally, your example, that was their whole point. And honestly, the reason Democrats drag ass on everything is because they have corporate interests, just like any politician. And because a lot of them are a lot more conservative than they are liberal. They're slowly starting to catch on that some of these more progressive policies are popular with voters, and so in order to keep their jobs, they're embracing those policies. So through all this, and apologies, but there's really no easy way to make the pivot back to the core premise of this video, but what lessons can we learn from the Democrats and apply to our own D&D games? Well, you might recall I made a video recently about how, in order to tell a story where your main characters are the heroes, it's best to not have a strong support structure behind them. And if you want to talk about a weak support structure, then look no further than the Democratic Party. Everything that makes them absolutely infuriating in the real world would make them extremely useful as NPCs for your fictional narrative. They support the same cause as the heroes, kinda, but they don't agree on the best way to solve those problems a lot of the time, and it's going to be extremely difficult to convince them to lend substantial support behind the cause. And this is honestly how the people in power in your D&D campaign should behave, because not only is it more realistic, but it also means the heroes will have no choice but to step up and get things done themselves. Fun fact, this is why liberals and leftists have a reputation for being annoying, because they're always advocating for something, they're never satisfied with what they have. But the reason for that is because they have to advocate, because it's the only way they can get the Democrats to actually do anything. Because these causes would actually meaningfully help people and improve their lives. But the Democrats are just impressively bad at follow-through. And that's what makes them ideal to model for the NPCs in authority in your own game. If you want healing potions, they're not just going to give them to you. You can buy them, though. They don't really care that you're going off to fight a dragon because they don't actually mind the dragon that much. It's not hunting them. But if you can publicly remind people that they have the healing potions, you can maybe convince them to give you a few. Maybe. There's also a limit to how helpful they're going to be. For example, let's say you want to recruit the city guard to come with you to fight the Lich. This is not a perfect metaphor since leftists rarely want more policing or military, but I'm making a comparison between leftist policies and the tropes of an action fantasy RPG. It's going to be a somewhat clumsy comparison sometimes. But let's say you want to recruit the city guard to come with you to fight the Lich. The people in power aren't just going to give you that. You have to earn it. You have to find a way to make them trust you. Again, that's very frustrating in the real world, but in the world of D&D, that's great. I mean, it's still going to frustrate your players, but you can parlay it into more D&D adventures, which is really what they came to the table to do anyway. And eventually, if you behave, and you're a good little adventurer who challenges the authorities in just the right way so as not to upset the status quo, they'll give you the army. But they're never going to give you the Vorpal sword that's hanging over their mantelpiece. If you want that, you actually have to go and steal it, which would be an awesome D&D quest. I would never advocate for real-life crime, for legal reasons. So let's say in this example that stealing the sword is a metaphor for protests that change the tenor of the cultural conversation. No matter how agreeable they are, the people in power are never going to give you the most important stuff, and so you'll have to protest for it. And they'll claim that that's you being irrational or uncivilized, but it's not. You need the thing to live and to help other people live. They don't need the thing. But they don't actually care that much about the bad guy, not as much as maintaining their position of privilege. They're still useful to a point, and they can be convinced to be more useful, but there are also some things they're never going to do, and you gotta fight for those things. And sadly, no matter how much leftists might dislike Democrats, they still have to vote for them, because the alternative is, worse. So let's talk about Republicans. As a note, some content warnings here for discussions around abortion, racism, transphobia, and gun violence. Now, you can probably already tell where my political biases lie, but I'm going to be as fair as possible. When discussing Republican policies, I'm going to drill down on the proposal as far as I can to try to reveal its implications. And the reason I have to do that is because Republicans are just better at messaging than Democrats are. So they're better at getting people on board with slogans or common sense ideas that actually mask other stuff. As our first example, let's look at abortion again. We all know how Republicans feel about abortion. They're pro-life. They want to protect the babies who can't advocate for themselves. Well, how could anybody question that? If you're pro-abortion, you must want babies to die. Well, first of all, no. Nobody wants to have to get an abortion, and nobody is choosing to do so recreationally. It's a medical intervention to keep someone from experiencing a huge life change that they may not be able to handle for any number of reasons. It's not like getting a tattoo. People don't do it for kicks. Now, let's also set aside the fact that Republicans pushing anti-abortion policy often don't think there should be exceptions for sexual assault or incest, which honestly speaks for itself. Let's set aside that they often don't think that there should be exceptions for non-viable pregnancies or pregnancies where the life of the mother would be in jeopardy, which also speaks for itself. Let's even set aside that the we'll call it an olive branch they offer to say they're not banning abortion, is to institute a ban after only 6 weeks, which they claim is enough time to figure out you're pregnant, even though, honestly, a lot of people don't discover that they're pregnant until after 6 weeks, just because that's how human reproduction works. Let's set aside that they ignore the scientific evidence that actually offers guidance on when a fetus becomes a living human being who might start to qualify for having rights, because the scientific consensus is inconvenient for the people who claim to be pro-life. Let's set aside that they claim Democrats want late-term abortion, which is just fully not a thing. Abortions that late in the pregnancy are not from people changing their minds about having a kid. Those are the medical interventions when a fetus will not be viable or the life of the mother will be in jeopardy. Let's set aside that their justification for banning abortion is that God does not want babies to die, which might be news to all the firstborn kids in Egypt or all the baby humans who did not make it onto the ark. And also the Constitution says we don't get to base laws on our religious beliefs. That was kind of important to those guys. Let's also set aside that these anti-abortion policies are often determined without the input of people who can actually get pregnant, marking yet another occasion in the history of mankind where important things about women's bodies are being decided without their input. And let's also set aside the fact that banning abortion is sometimes justified by some white supremacist bullshit about making sure people aren't aborting white babies because something great replacement theory. Okay, let's set all of that aside. And don't get me wrong, that all seems pretty bad. But let's look at the simplest fact. Statistics prove that banning abortion does not reduce the number of abortions. Because people don't get abortions for fun, then when they need an abortion, they're gonna still want one even if it's illegal. It's not a crime of opportunity. It's a necessity just to, be able to live the life you want when an unplanned pregnancy occurs. If you want to reduce the number of abortions, you put more money into sex education, because that actually reduces the number of unplanned pregnancies. Not completely to zero. Obviously, accidents still happen, so we should still ensure safe and legal abortion is available to those who need them, even if we do vastly improve the sex education in this country. Speaking of which, let's move on to education. Because Republicans have been trying to disassemble education for decades in various forms. Through the banning of books by claiming certain content is too controversial, by just neutering public education across the board, and by allowing student loans to skyrocket, which acts as a gatekeeping force to prevent people from getting higher education. Republicans are also firmly anti-intellectual, rejecting appeals to science and rationality by claiming that everyone who disagrees with them on an academic or scientific basis has been apparently paid for by Democrats or something very similar. This is yet another effort being made to discredit education. And why do they go through all these steps? Because they've openly admitted that higher educated people don't vote for them. So they want fewer people to be higher educated. Also, just as a fun note, if your policies are such that you know that people only vote for you if they're less educated, as in they literally know less about the world, maybe your policies are bad. Speaking of openly admitting something, they absolutely don't want to admit anybody through the border. They are firmly anti-immigration, at least for non-European immigrants. I'm not calling every Republican voter a racist because Republicans mask this xenophobia in, well, a different form of xenophobia and racism. They claim that immigrants are coming for your jobs, which they're not. More jobs are lost every year to automation because CEOs would rather pay a machine than a human being, doesn't matter where the people come from. Republicans also claim that immigrants are smuggling in drugs like fentanyl, but that's actually coming in through legal ports of entry, specifically being brought in by border police more often than not. They claim immigrants commit more crimes, but they don't. That's just provable by science. People do research into all these sorts of stuff. So why don't Republicans want immigrants to come to the US? Well, aside from the earlier stated xenophobia and racism, which is certainly a factor, at least for some politicians, it's because they know people who immigrated to the US tend to vote for Democrats and not Republicans. Given all the Republican rhetoric we just discussed, it's not very hard to see why. On that note, Republicans just want fewer people to vote overall. They don't want to allow mail-in ballots because they know a majority of mail-in ballots are sent by BIPOC people, because BIPOC people tend to work the sorts of jobs that don't give them any time off to vote on election day. And BIPOC people tend to vote Democrat. Republicans also gerrymander their districts to a ridiculous degree because they have to sort voters of color into their own districts in order to try to hold on to power, because otherwise they wouldn't be able to win the majority in these states. A lot of red states would be much bluer, or at least purple, if they weren't gerrymandered all to hell. Republicans whine about Taylor Swift inspiring people to register to vote because she has a young audience, and young people tend to vote for Democrats over Republicans. Republicans rant about illegal voting to reduce faith in the institution and try to push laws like requiring an ID to vote. Not because illegal voting is a huge issue. It's not. As we saw from all the audits, there's very, very little illegal voting nationwide, and certainly not enough to swing any elections. But they introduce these laws because they know BIPOC people are less likely to have a government-issued ID, so introducing these laws helps gatekeep them from voting. How about climate change? Well, Republicans claim that it's not real, which it is, or that humans didn't have a hand in it, which they did, or that it'll go back to normal on its own, which it won't, or that humans will just adapt to change, which we're trying to do by passing policies to address climate change. If you would stop blocking it, then we'll get right on that and start adapting. Republicans obviously know climate change is real. They're not stupid. They just like the status quo, and they know they won't suffer any major setbacks from climate change, at least not in their lifetime, so they'd rather hold on to the power they have than risk any change potentially impacting their bottom line. Republicans also don't want universal health care. They seem to be ideologically opposed to it, not because they don't want the government to interfere in healthcare, as they might claim. Remember all the abortion bans they passed? They clearly don't care about government getting involved in healthcare. No, they don't like the idea of the government providing for people. They're in power because they have money and resources, and they'd like to keep that, please, so they mask it in language about being scared of socialism, but that's not why. They know that universal healthcare is not uncommon in most other developed countries in the world. They just don't seem to care. Speaking of all the money and power they like to hold on to, you know they don't want to tax the rich. They want tax breaks for the rich, and they dress it up in language they've been using since the 80s, the idea of trickle-down economics. But that's not a thing, and it never has been. Money doesn't trickle down, it just gets hoarded at the top. Hey, speaking of income inequality, Republicans don't like unions and they don't like strikes. They like it when the people in business have all the money and have all the power. They claim to be pro-union, but when it's actually time for unions to want things, the Republicans claim that the workers are being unfair to the businesses. This is also why they don't support raising the minimum wage. Well, okay, how do Republicans feel about discrimination? You already know. They've gone all in on their war on wokeness, and the general definition of woke is just about being aware of unfair systems and trying to address discrimination, so by extrapolation, that means the Republicans are pro-discrimination. And we already knew that from how they've been lying about trans people and lying about drag queens. Nearly every claim they make about either group is verifiably wrong. They're just openly lying and getting away with it because most people don't know better yet. But the young people do, and our children and their children will absolutely look back at this moment in history as a horrible era where Republicans demonized queer people and especially trans people in some of the most horrifying ways imaginable. But that's just how they're reacting to a more recent civil rights movement. When it comes to the stuff that they've had a lot more practice with, Republicans mask a lot of their other discrimination in progressive-sounding ideas, like being colorblind. That's why they went after affirmative action, after all, because if something gives people an advantage because of the color of their skin, then that thing must be racist, and not what the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King would have wanted. After all, judge them by the content of their character. It's the whole thing. Except, first of all, Dr. King actually said a bunch of stuff. He was a pretty progressive guy. His final goal absolutely was not, you should stop judging black people by their skin color. That was his starting goal. Second, we know from facts that discriminatory hiring practices still happen, usually without conscious bias. Discriminatory college admittance still happens, usually without conscious bias. We don't live in a post-racial country. So affirmative action is designed to help fill in those gaps until we can actually get to a point where those sorts of biases don't occur. And of course, Republicans are welcome to help do what they can to achieve that goal, but it would be a lot easier to do that if they would stop banning any book that happens to discuss race. Because if you haven't actually solved the root problems affirmative action seeks to compensate for, and then you get rid of affirmative action too, then you're just going to wind up with a lot more BIPOC people getting sidelined. I wonder why they would want that. I mean, aside from just the racism, I wonder why they might want fewer BIPOC people to get into higher education or to receive higher paying jobs where they're more likely to be able to take time off of work for one random Tuesday in November every 2 years. It's a mystery. And look, we didn't even have to talk about gun violence, do we? Yes, we do. Yes, we do, because Republicans have been very clear that their only answer to the ridiculously tragic number of mass shootings we have in this country is to do everything they can to shift the blame away from guns. They blame mental illness, which, setting aside the fact that it is not good to link mental illness and violence when nothing actually connects them, if they actually thought mental illness was responsible, they would fund mental illness, and they don't, so they know it's not mental illness. They claim that you can't take away someone's right to own a gun, which, first of all, a right to own a gun is not more important than not murdering kids. Second, how pro-life are you if you don't care about all the dead kids? Third, no one's actually saying get rid of all the guns. I mean, we're getting there. I honestly wouldn't mind it, but setting aside my personal feelings on the matter, every serious piece of legislation on the topic does not even target handguns intended for self-defense or rifles intended to hunt deer or rabbits. They target assault weapons that are only designed to murder a lot of people very quickly. Republicans try to claim that banning guns would mean only the bad guys would get guns because if someone wants to get a gun, they're gonna find a way to get a gun. Which, okay, even if that were true, it would mean that getting the gun would be a crime and maybe authorities could catch people for that crime, and so more people would get arrested at that point in the process, and not as many people would get to the point where they can murder a bunch of people really quickly. So if it's still true that the bad guys would still try to get guns, that would actually still be fine. But also, it's not true. Gun violence, more often than not, is a crime of opportunity. It's been extremely challenging for anybody to actually do meaningful research into gun violence thanks to political pressure from certain groups that really love guns, but the research we do have is pretty clear that when there are fewer guns around, people do less gun crime. I don't mean to be flippant, but Republicans literally claim that banning abortion will make abortion stop and banning guns won't make gun violence stop, and they're wrong both times. I mean, maybe they're right, and just imagine how smug they would be if we banned assault weapons and then over the course of 5, 10, 20 years, gun violence didn't go down. You know what? Why don't we try it? Let's just try it and see. And if that doesn't work and they do get to be smug, then you know what? Let's try a different thing. Let's try something. Look, this is not the point of the video, but while we're on the subject, if you're voting Republican, I mean this sincerely, what are you voting for? What is the issue that gets you to the ballot box? Because the Democrats might not be great at implementing their policies, and they might not actually care about some of their policies, but a lot of the policies themselves are good. They're there to make everybody's lives better. Republican policies are absolutely horrendous. Their only goal seems to be to hold on to power or to make everyone's lives worse. So, again, hard pivot here, but what can we learn from Republicans when we're developing NPCs for our D&D games? Well, first, there are some NPCs you just won't convince, because their motivations aren't and will never be altruistic or logical. They're selfish, and even if their policies weren't logically incoherent, which they are, and even if their policies could hold water when confronted by facts, which they don't, and even if they believed all the rhetoric they use to sell these policies to their base, which they also don't, well then their opinions and goals would still be dogshit, because Republicans cannot imagine a better world. Their only belief is that we need to uphold the status quo, or in some cases, return to a status quo from decades ago where all the minorities, and also all the women, and also anybody who isn't rich, and also anybody queer, and also, it's a longer list, but where all those people have far fewer rights. And when your D&D world is in danger from a big scary monster, like a dragon or a Tarrasque or climate change, and some people in power cannot be convinced to help because they know it would require giving up a little bit of their power or money, well, they might not be the final big boss, and that's only a maybe, by the way, but they are still villains. They might not be the Velociraptors or the T-Rex, but they are Dennis Nedry, uncaringly releasing dinosaurs in order to make a little bit more money. Except Nedry at least didn't release the Velociraptors because he knew better. But as we've seen from every major public health crisis, most recently the COVID-19 pandemic, Republicans absolutely would not give a shit which dinosaurs they released. And that's just when we're talking about the big, profound threats where the Republicans aren't actually the literal cause of the problem, like the increased legislation of transphobia, and the attacks on abortion, just to name a few. Also, sometimes they're Belloc from Raiders of the Lost Ark, or Donovan from The Last Crusade, because they talk about God a lot, and yet they're willing to work with literal Nazis. Also, sometimes they're Stanley Tucci in The Terminal, because they're obsessed with harassing immigrants and unhoused people. But since we're on the subject of Republicans, this is where I have good news for you. See, you play D&D, or Pathfinder, or Monster of the Week, or Blades in the Dark, but the point is, you have a hobby where you and your friends imagine a world that is in need of some serious change, and then you imagine that that change is possible, and then you enact that change. And that means that you already have a better imagination than any Republican. And so that tells me that you deserve better than them. And don't get me wrong, we deserve better than the Democrats too, but they're absolutely not the fucking same. At their worst, the Democrats are the mayor from Jaws, who totally sucks, do not get me wrong. But eventually, things got bad enough that people pressured him to sign the legislation he needed to, and then the heroes did the rest of the work and dealt with the problem themselves. All politicians are villains from Spielberg movies. That's the most important takeaway from this video. But Republicans don't learn. They can't. Because that would imply any level of imagination on their part. And they cannot conceive of a better world that isn't just the 1950s again. The other good news is that they're super duper losing. They're like the villains in a Stephen King book, where at a certain point, it doesn't take much for them just to completely self-destruct to a frankly humiliating degree. And I don't know about you, but after watching a political party skull-fuck the climate and human rights for decades, it's a relief to see that they're having trouble getting it up for once. And if you're watching this, and any of the rhetoric that Republicans use to fight for their causes appeals to you, I actually understand. I totally get it. There are things that frustrate you and upset you, and they've told you it's because of your enemies, or their enemies, rather. But that's not the case. They know that the world is screwed up and the country is broken. They just don't care. But I care about you. I want you to get to live in a world that is better for everybody. And judging by their policies, that's something the Republicans truly don't seem to care about on any level. Thank you so much for watching. The comment section for this video is going to be interesting, but if all you want to do is say that I shouldn't be making videos about politics on a D&D YouTube channel, then I encourage you to come back here on Monday for this video about why I do that. In the meantime, if you want to see more videos from me, most of which are not literally about politics, then subscribe and ring the bell. If you want to support the channel and you're able to, financially, then you can do that on my Patreon. I didn't take a sponsor for this video because I felt like it might prompt some unreasonable reactions, and I don't want to expose any of my sponsors to that kind of backlash. And I suspect this video might be targeted for demonetization, so any support you're able to offer on Patreon, if you're willing, would be a huge help. Come and hang out on my Discord server to hang out with other awesome people. Follow me on Twitch to hang out when I have the time to go live, and subscribe to my newsletter to stay up to date with my latest updates. Since we talked about a real-life evil faction in this video, click here for my recent video about the different ways to present evil factions in D&D. Until next time, play fair and have fun.